Could everybody please sit down? We have a very, very short time, an hour, to solve a question of the last 400 years, at least, namely the optimal social contract. And I don't want to lose even a second. So I'm Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. I'm moderating, and I'm going to introduce our speakers before I introduce the topic in order in which they will introduce their views. They will have up to 5 minutes each to explain their view of the contrat social of the future. And then we'll have a little discussion amongst ourselves, and then it will be for questions from the floor. I hope something will be done about the lighting by then, because at the moment I cannot see anybody. So that won't work, that won't go too well. The first speaker will be Zeenat Rahman from the US, who's sitting in the middle, who is Special Advisor on Global Youth Issues to the Secretary of State, John Kerry. Our second speaker will be Professor Axel to her left, not difficult to work out who he is, who is Chairman of the Board of Directors of UBS, and of course before that was the President of the Bundesbank, and is a very, very distinguished economist, as well as, of course, an immensely important banker now. And the final speaker to my left is Lady Barbara Judge, who is the chair of the Pension Protection Fund and a great expert on nuclear power issues, which she'll be talking about this afternoon. That's a promo, I suppose. Let me briefly introduce the topic. It is so enormous that I expect it will be quite difficult to get an interaction. In the notes I was given, I was, for fairly understandable chauvinistic reasons, referred to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But of course, coming from Britain, I don't regard him as a particularly important social contract theorist. Hobbes and Locke were far more important and above all preceded him. But I'm actually going to suggest that there's somebody else from all these three people who really had at the core of his thinking on this topic, the core of the question we're addressing, and that person was Edmund Burke, the great late 18th century Irish stroke British conservative theorist, and I use conservative in its traditional rather than modern sense in the US. He had the idea that society, and I think I've got more or less exactly the right phrase, but it might be slightly wrong, was a contract between the past, the present, and the future. And that's exactly the topic we're talking about. The past bequeaths to us a stock of assets, both physical, cultural, natural, which we, the present, enjoy, and which we have, in his view, an obligation to transmit to the future, correcting what is defective and trying to leave something better than we inherited. And that seems to me a very useful way of thinking about this intertemporal social contract, which is the subject of this debate, because it puts the present, namely those now living and particularly those now in power, in a trustee role for a continuing social contract operating through time. So that's the first main point I want to make in introduction. And the second point is that we start thinking about this trustee role. It's natural, and this is the point I mostly made in my own workshop yesterday. This has become very dominated by what I think of as essentially distributional questions associated with the welfare state, debt, and so forth. These are important questions. I don't deny that. But it seems to me there's another and much more profound question, which is the total stock of capital, very broadly defined, namely physical, human, natural, and social, that we have inherited, that we bequeath, because it is from that that future generations, the present young and their children and grandchildren, so forth, will live. So the question from the trustee role, in my view, is more about the total stock of capital and the appropriateness of that capital that we're bequeathing. So to me, the biggest intergenerational equity question of our time, without any doubt, is climate change. Much more than the questions concerning whether we borrow too much this year or next year, which are, to me, second or third order questions. So with that, that's my introduction to what we should be thinking about. Whether this will have any influence on the other speakers, I have no idea. But let me turn and give the first voice, the first word to Zeenat.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Hello, everybody. I want to start by thanking St. Gallen organizers, particularly the students who have worked so hard in the last few days to make this a really seamless and enjoyable experience for all of us. And then a special kind of thank you to the leaders of tomorrow who attended my session last night at 11 o'clock, because to me you showed true dedication to getting the most out of this conference. My comments will focus on, I want to make 3 quick points, but really the role of young people in the present as they're looking at their future. You know, all around the world, young people are questioning their relationship with the state. And this is in the context of figuring out what their identity is, you know, what they stand for, and how they can be successful in the world. And of course, this plays out in a global way in the sense that their peer group is a global audience of peers, that they get to see what others have, and they want it too. And so this is in the context of the Western world, but certainly, you know, in a global context as well. I wanted to just offer an example of the United States, which is where I'm from. And I think for us, the American dream was the best illustration of the social contract. The idea that you could come from anywhere, that there would be a sense of upward mobility. You would be able to get a solid education, which would allow you a stable job, which would allow you, you know, a house, being able to provide for your children, and then hopefully some disposable income for retirement. And I would suggest that that story is in question a little bit. And you know, I am a benefactor of the American dream. My own story is that my dad immigrated to the United States in the 1970s. He was a mechanical engineer by university training, but started his first job in the States sweeping a paint shop. So he worked for a paint factory and became manager and kind of found a career moving all the way up the chain, where he was able to provide for his 3 daughters primary education. We were very lucky to not have to take out student loans for primary education for our graduate school we did. And he has, you know, 3 daughters who've done a pretty good job. And so, I mean, I'm not self-congratulating. My other 2 sisters are way, way better than I am. But, you know, I think there's a real question as to whether this would be a successful dream, or whether this would be achievable today, whether for me as his daughter, or even for him in terms of the upward mobility that he faced. And so if we look at American millennials, they're unique. They're the most diverse generation of young people, of Americans that have ever existed. They have a naturally outward-looking view of the world. Many would like to live in foreign capitals, travel abroad, live abroad. They'll have 7 to 8 jobs over the course of their lifetime, many jobs that don't exist yet, in industries that don't exist yet. And I think, as I did, you know, many of them have followed the direction of their parents, you know, whether it's about schooling or what degree to choose, but they're finding that the outcomes are not the same. So that's not always leading to the same type of outcome. And we know, we've had this conversation, that an undergraduate degree is maybe worth less than it was before. And so as more wealth is concentrated among fewer, you know, I do think it's imperative that this social contract be redistributed to give more to young people, particularly focusing on the cost of college education for us in the United States. And then education that is better at meeting the demands of the market. So whether it's adaptive to the different jobs that young people will have that are not defined yet, or just in tighter synergy with the jobs that are in the marketplace that the private sector is demanding. So that's the first point. The second point is, you know, I think we have to do a rethink about values-based leadership and the definition of success. So in the absence of options and access to opportunity to be productive citizens, you found young people forging their own paths. And so whether this is, the 16-year-old high school student in Sarasota, Florida, who learned how to code and has a really successful app, one of the most successful apps right now, or even in a place like Egypt, where there's an incubator called Flat 6 Labs, that young people, what you're noticing, are innovating beyond the challenges and maybe the failure of what the state hasn't been able to offer them. And so one very unique aspect of this generation is they're demanding that social good, this idea of doing something that has a social outcome, be incorporated into their professional choices. And so they're driven by profit, but also by passion and by purpose. And so when we look at the leaders of today here today, and then consider the leaders of tomorrow, is the definition of success going to be the same? And I think we probably have to redefine that, and it should maybe be a values-based conversation of the assets that young people are bringing to this conversation, and that the state has a responsibility, so young people have a responsibility to participate and be participatory in their societies, but similarly, the state has a responsibility to shape a social contract that is responsive and inclusive to different points of view. How am I doing on time?
You've got about a minute.
Okay. So my third point is just that this isn't a conversation that we can just have in the West. Clearly, all around the world, young people are having similar challenges, and global conversations about the limits of the state in providing social goods. And global youth unemployment indicates that the system has failed. Even anecdotally, if you look at the essay competition that happened at St. Gallen amongst the leaders of tomorrow, almost 50% of those essays were on youth unemployment. And so as we look kind of forward into what is a new social contract, I think it is one that needs to be inclusive of a global audience, not solely based on nation-state equities, and that I think it can be collectively about mutually beneficial outcomes, so I don't buy into the clash of generations, because I think me getting something doesn't take anything away from somebody else. That's not how we should be looking at the future world that we're building. And so I would say that, we don't know the answers of what a new social contract should look like, but we know that it should be adaptive, that it should be based on the assets and include diverse points of view in shaping what that looks like.
Thank you very much. Certainly sets out plenty of issues to think about. Axel.
Thank you, Martin. Well, let me first thank also the organizers for inviting me and for having chosen a very ambitious but also important subject today. I'll strictly limit my comments to the economic side of this social contract discussion. From an economic point of view, the whole debate about the social contract today relates into the question, from my view, about taxes and transfers, about the size of government, the amount of redistribution from working population to non-working population. So I'm deliberately focusing on what Martin mentioned, the narrow focus, so I will not go into these longer-term discussions, but I'm sure it'll come up in the discussion. In my view, today's social contract is overstretched in many advanced economies. Transfers and taxes have become too high. If you go back to the Middle Ages, peasants used to pay about 10% of their income to the ruler. If the ruler became greedy, the peasants started revolting and they burned down the ruler's castle. Nowadays, the share of public sector in GDP is 50%, and we have civilized discussions like this one. Now, I think that's the right way to go, so don't get me wrong. But in my view, it just shows that the whole issue is of a completely different dimension now than it was in the past. In my view, the debt crisis also in peripheral Europe is in part caused by overstretched social contracts. Taxes and transfers have become too large in many countries and have become a burden to the economy. And in my view, due to demographic changes, the burden will increase further in most of the countries over the next decades. And it's very easy to look into the studies that are available for that. It's basically true for every country. Now, let me make 3 statements on the way forward, and then I'll open for debate. The first one is, in my view, the only way to save the social contract, which is broken, is by reforming the system. In most European economies, I think that the labor market reforms are the core, in addition to pension reforms, for reforming that social contract. In many countries, restrictive labor laws divide the working age population into insiders, those with a protected job, and outsiders, those that are unable to find work. The high youth unemployment in many of the European countries, and Spain is a number that is often referred to, where the unemployment rate has moved up to 25% and youth unemployment is 50%. Millions of young people are denied a normal working life. They will have a problem later on in their life from this very bad start into their working careers, and this will have long-lasting effects and consequences on their entire life, on their society, and I think it is one of the biggest crimes that Europe is committing to keep young people out of jobs. So, this is not in our own self-interest either, because if you look at dependency rates, in the 70s, you used to have 4 people in work for every 1 pensioner. This has now moved to 3 people, I'm talking about Swiss data here, Swiss people on the job for every 1 pensioner. And it will move to 2 people on the job for every 1 pensioner in 2030 when the baby boomers have retired. So a doubling of the dependency ratio. If we have the young people not enter the job market on highly qualified jobs, like you just alluded to your own career, that dependency ratio will have a much lower income earning potential within those on the job, and therefore the amount of resources that are allocated to the system from those in work will come down as a quality but also as a quantity issue. We need to do things that improve that. Second, there is no way around the need to reform the pension system, in my view, in particular by massively increasing pension age. An example that I like to use, and I think, Martin, I've seen you use it in the past as well, because it just shows very clearly the mismatch. In Germany, we had our pension system introduced by Bismarck in the 1850s. Bismarck introduced this system with a pension age of 65 years. Life expectancy was 59, so the system was well funded. Largely because of a large infant mortality at the time. Fast forward to today, or to the 2000s, the start of the 2000s, life expectancy had moved up from 59 to 83. Pension system was still at 65 retirement age. Actually, effective retirement age was at 61 because people retired early from their jobs. Schröder moved the pension age out by moving it up by 1 month every year, so phasing in until 2030 a pension retirement age that was 67. It cost him the job because there was a big pushback on reforms like that. I was on the Council of German Economic Advisors advising the Schröder government to do that. Now, I was an economic advisor, not a political one, so I was focused on the reforms, not on the likelihood of maintaining the job. So he did the right thing. There was some collateral damage, including himself, but as an economist, that is rarely important. For economists, what matters is you reform the system rather than you're self-serving. So he did the right thing. The question is, has he done enough? He's not done enough. He should have indexed the pension system to retirement age. He should have indexed the retirement age to the pension system, and then pension systems would go up in sync with aging, and we would have had a step change to go much further than the 67. But of course, the problem then is, how do you create and secure jobs for the elderly? That's an important and vital part you need to match. Finally, the question of not fixing the reforms, in my view, is a different one. The question boils down to, can we actually, in a fair sense, reform the system? In my view, fair means, since the system is broken, it's much less the question of whether it's fair to reform the pension system and whether it's fair to improve and increase the retirement age. I think it's fair to reform a pension system because if we don't fix it, we will be very bad servants to future generations, because we will put them in a situation that is already unsustainable now and will become a real burden on their future. So how do we reform the system before the crisis hits? In my view, if we want to prevent the social contract from entirely breaking, we need to basically reform the system now, and we need to take decisive steps. So let me end with that.
Thank you very much. You raised an immense number of issues. I was wondering as you was thinking whether Angela Merkel is as grateful as she should be for your role in her ascension to the Chancellorship of Germany.
She didn't show that support so far.
That was precisely why I raised the question. Politicians are so ungrateful, aren't they?
Especially when they lose the job, Martin.
Well, they've never liked me very much either. Barbara.
Getting into this crossfire is a bit of a trick. So I just came back from Japan, where I was helping with the nuclear energy problem there, and I'm coming back to talk to you about pensions. People always ask me why I talk about pensions and nuclear, and I think they're both long-term problems. Certainly things we have to think about. So first, let me add my thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference. I was privileged to be here last year, and of all the conferences I go to, this is the most seamless, the most luxurious, and you're right, the young people are wonderful. Thank you all for helping me get here from Japan to Toronto to here. So Axel talked a little bit about pensions. I am chairman of the UK Pension Protection Fund. And this is from the discussion of principles to the discussion of practice. And what have we done in the UK in order to think about pensions? Well, the problem is not new. As I was going to say, Bismarck said the age was 65, but nobody ever lived that far. British noblemen have been giving pensions to their servants for a long time, A, for a reward for long service, and B, to keep their secrets. And they did have secrets to keep, as you know. Second of all, we had this problem with Robert Maxwell. Does anybody remember Maxwell? Maxwell, right? Well, there was a good pension system for his media empire. Maxwell fell perhaps off the boat, and guess what? We found 50% of the pension fund was used to fund that boat or his lifestyle, and the pensioners got 50% of what they expected. It used to be in the UK and various other countries that the social contract worked. At least it worked in big companies where you worked hard, your employer paid into the system, you paid into the system, you retired, and you had a pension. That worked for a while, but lots of things changed. First, Maxwell changed. Then other companies started rating their pensions. Then it was not just a promise. The government came in and made pension reform an obligation. Companies were obligated to pay pensions. The government in the UK put its hand into the pension funds, took out some money. Then there wasn't enough money to pay people's pensions. All of a sudden there was a promise, an employee, and no money. And that's where we were about 10 years ago in the UK. And there was a big bankruptcy. It was called Allied Steel. The people who were paying into their pensions for a very long period of time, these Allied Steel workers, there was a bankruptcy, no pensions. They were stripped of their pensions, and they didn't like it. And what they did was very interesting. They marched in front of the parliament. They marched to explain what it was like to be stripped of your pensions. And so they stripped. And there they were, marching in front of parliament, stripped, almost naked, down to their underwear. It made the point. It made it loud and clear. And what happened in the UK was about 10 years ago, we formed something called the Pension Protection Fund, which is a way to help pensioners. What it does is it has employers, the defined benefit pension employers, contribute what is called a levy. Essentially, it's an insurance premium into the Pension Protection Fund, of which I am the chairman. We take that levy money, we invest it, hopefully wisely, so far we have, and when a company goes bankrupt or otherwise can't pay its pensioners, the Pension Protection Fund will pay them. It pays them an amount of money which is necessary and appropriate. It's not as much as they might have gotten before, but it's less than nothing. So it does protect the pensioners. Well, I'm sorry, more than nothing, I apologize. Airplanes from Tokyo to Toronto to here sometimes rattle the brain. We pay them £5,000 to £100,000, depending upon what they've put into the pension pot over the years. So we have tried in the UK to set up a way to deal with the problem that Axel was talking about. We've tried to reform the system. We continue to try to reform it. The government itself provides a pension, just like it does in the United States with Social Security. Government workers get pensions based on contributions. They've been very complicated in the UK. We're trying to simplify it by giving people a single state pension, but it is only £150 a week. £150 a week is nice, but it's not going to make a comfortable retirement. We're going to have to do something else. Pension Protection Fund works for workplace pensions. Defined benefit plans did work. As you all know, most defined benefit plans are closing now. We have defined contribution plans. The employee puts in money, the employer puts in money, but there's no guarantee. It's up to the employee to invest the money wisely or unwisely. The employer is now not worried about it. That's something, but it's not reforming the social contract. We have to find a way that people can look after themselves as well as depending upon the state. The state can do so much, but low interest rates means that most pension funds are basically in deficit. Deficits show up on your balance sheet. FDs don't like that. Companies are not looking at defined benefit plans or at pensions as a way to recruit employees like they used to, because nobody today can hope to stay in their job for most of their career. We're all popping around and having to deal with our retirement on our own. So my own theory about how to solve the pension crisis is threefold. Save more, work longer, and expect less. Thank you.
Okay, let's discuss one or two issues for about 10 minutes, perhaps 15, and then we'll have questions. I want some incredibly brilliant questions, and just to give you a warning, when I say a question, I actually do mean a question, and I know the difference between a question and a statement. So bear that in mind. I'm going to start with the most obvious intergenerational question, which you've all just touched on in different ways. And I'm going to do it in two ways. Pensions and the job market, since that was central to our discussion. I mean, one comment that I think is very important is to remember that the systems of different countries are radically different. And the generosity of different parts of the system are radically different. So a number of continental countries have extremely generous pay-as-you-go systems by the standards of, say, the UK, which has the meanest pay-as-you-go system imaginable. I don't think one can easily argue that British pensioners are incredibly generously treated by the state. The US is somewhere in between. So it's very important to understand that the intergenerational aspects differ. In the US, problems associated of future spending are much more about healthcare, which actually hasn't even been raised here, than about Social Security. But just a couple of questions on pensions, and I suppose the relationship with intragenerational equality. So I'll start with you, Axel. I think this is quite an important issue. One of the, it seems to me, relatively legitimate reasons why people might be worried about raising retirement ages, so the logic behind what you say is completely clear, is that, and this is very clear in many countries, maybe less true in Germany, I don't know, but certainly true in Britain and the US, that the life expectancy of individuals has begun to diverge dramatically with respect to their own incomes. So that the people who would be most damaged by being forced to retire later are the people whose life expectancies are relatively short, and many of whom, because they do physical labor, will find it actually relatively difficult to continue working. So isn't there something profoundly inegalitarian about focusing on raising retirement ages as the solution? That seems to me quite a big issue. How would you respond to that?
Well, exactly, there is this problem, and that's why I think you should at least have a flexible system that allows those that want to work longer to stay on the job longer and not to have forced retirements. Because in many of these countries, we do have forced retirement ages, and that are the same almost across the industry. Of course, you're absolutely right. Healthcare, Medicare is related to income. The more healthy are the ones that are more wealthy and have higher incomes. But you should have a system where you allow those people to stay on and do the job, even past retirement age. And in my view, that would lift the retirement age in general for society. And there are other jobs, as you said, hard manual jobs, where basically health issues crop up much earlier, and you should have a differentiated retirement age depending on further life expectancy, and further life expectancy is quite different between manual work and, say, white-collar work. So I do agree with you, but I think you can easily fix that by having a differentiated retirement age across the various sectors of the economy, rather than a unique one across all the different industries.
So that's very important. So basically what you're saying is that we all have to move to a vastly more flexible retirement system, which to some extent provides presumably some minimum for people who really have to retire for whatever reasons, but also encourages people to work longer, possibly forever. I have to say that the younger people in my own organization are just praying for me to retire. So for them, this is very bad news. And that actually raises a question I would like to ask both Barbara and Zeenat, which is, okay, our generation, my generation, Axel's going to go on working forever. What earthly reason is there to suppose that if we're going to fill all the jobs that are going now, that all these new jobs are suddenly going to materialize, good new jobs for young people?
I have a problem with that. First of all, my mother worked till she was 87, and when she retired, she started to get dementia. So I'm a believer that we ought to be able to work as long as we can. This is a very ageist world we live in. Most people are forced to retire, as Axel said. Remember, I said work longer. I think society has an obligation to give us an opportunity, older people, to work longer, but we have to worry about young people. If we all stay in our jobs, are there going to be jobs for young people? I would ask this question. Every time I go to the airport and I give my boarding pass in, there used to be a woman who read it, or a man, and then let you go through. Today I went to the airport and there was a machine there reading the boarding pass. Every time I go to the airport, some other person is removed of their job. Are we technologically putting young people out of jobs and older people out of jobs? And is all change progress? If we're all saying that people need jobs, young ones and older ones, in order to support the system, and at the same time we're progressing our way to an opportunity for machines to do our jobs, how are we going to reform the system?
Let me just follow up, and a specific question. I'd be very happy if you respond to anything else, but if you imagine that in every organization, basically everyone who's reasonably successful, healthy, is just going to go on working till they're 90. Isn't that a pretty grim prospect for young people? When are they ever going to get to the top? Unless they create, unless they're Bill Gates or Larry Page and can create Google and Microsoft from scratch, or the WhatsApp. I mean, not everybody can do that, can they? Isn't that sort of grim that somehow you're just never going to get rid of your parents and grandparents?
I mean, so I think that's operating on the assumption that young people want the jobs that old people have, and I don't agree with that. And so I think that, as I said, if 7 to 8 young people today are going to have 7 to 8 jobs over the course of their lifetime in fields that are not defined yet, or industries that are not defined yet, in jobs that are not defined yet, adaptation is really what we have to all focus on, whether you're looking at the older end of the workforce of the spectrum or the entry-level place. And so, I mean, what are the skills that people need to acquire, young, old, or whoever, to be able to be adaptive to that workforce? Certainly technology is one of them. I mean, we can be sad that things are automated, but it's going to. The only thing guaranteed is change, and so we either choose as societies how we're going to adapt and respond to that change, and it's not by hiding our head in the sand or perpetuating jobs that no longer need to be done by people. It's painful. It's not easy. I think a dose of realism, I think, as you said, is important as well, both for young people and for just, even somebody who's in the middle of their career, about what retirement will look like. I mean, I probably will work until I can no longer work because I don't have a big cushion of retirement, being a federal government worker for a few years. And so, I think adaptation is key, but really focusing on skill sets and not thinking there's a finite number of jobs that if you get something, it takes away from me as a young person. I just think that's an entirely wrong outlook.
Axel, just to follow up on that, if you look at our societies, Germany's been doing relatively well recently in terms of generating employment, so it has some byproducts in terms of productivity. The UK has actually, and the byproduct is with productivity growth has stopped. The US has had a remarkably bad experience in recent years in terms of employment creation, and yet we think of this as the most flexible of all economies, clearly the one with the most dynamic technology. So the question of whether our economic system is actually capable of generating, with the technological change, the adaptation we need, the jobs that will clearly be part of the solution, we all agree on that, for everybody, as it were, because we can't afford retirement. Is that going to happen? Why should we be optimistic that's going to happen?
I'm pretty much in the same camp, saying technological innovation will be driving many things. There will be jobs we don't even know what they're like, and we've seen that over the recent years. If you take, Germany's always posted out there as the miracle example. Unemployment rate came down from around 10% to now 7%. I now live in Switzerland. Unemployment here is 3%. The debt to GDP ratio is 30%. In Germany, it's moved up to 80. Implicit liabilities of the government until 2030, if you put them down sort of into current value, there is an 160% implicit government liability in Switzerland, but it's 270% in Germany. So there are countries like Switzerland that are innovating, that are creating jobs, and that don't have enough people in Switzerland to fill this job. There's a big influx of foreign workers into Switzerland, and there's just been a vote in Switzerland to actually limit that flux of work, because Switzerland is coming to a point where 20% of the workforce is non-Swiss workers, and that's a pretty high value sort of in any country. And so there will always be innovation, and I think there is specialization, and I'm pretty confident that the world will keep innovating. Look at all the new technology. Wealth management business that I'm in now is completely changing, and unlike in the past, the rollout of new technologies like iPads and iPhones into all generations of the society is the same. In the past, the rollout of technology would happen with the young. And what made sure that the young would get the next jobs of the old was they would be technologically better trained and ahead of us, the older, on that job. And eventually they became better, and we had to leave because we couldn't keep up anymore. That's happening now in a different way. Technology is rolled out at the same pace between the old and the young. There's no difference. And that is changing the world profoundly. And I think we have to keep up with technological change. There's just no way to be romantic about it and hope we can go back to the jobs of the past. I've been having 3 jobs in my life so far. I was 20 years an academic, I was 10 years a policymaker and central banker, and now I'm in the private sector. You cannot work your life in a single job anymore. That's a thing of the past. And even if you're successful, you have to go through various jobs. And we just have to be flexible enough to do that.
Can I just turn to the other end? We were talking about pensions and jobs more generally, but let's talk about education. Because I think Zeenat introduced that, and I think it's a core issue here. In Europe, Britain is a bit in between. It's a core function of the state. It pays basically for it all. And in the US, on the other hand, enormous debt associated particularly with the college level. So again, very different solutions. But I'm clearly, in the world you're describing, flexible, adaptable. This would seem to imply a need for both a very high level of education at the beginning and lots of re-education through life. That seems to be a core part of making this system in which everybody works forever work, and the flexibility work. So I'll start with Zeenat because you raised it, and I think it's a very core issue. How does one fund this? What is a fair way of funding it? And here I have a very specific figure in mind, and you may correct me, but I remember reading in somewhere that the current generation of young American people in their 20s, is the first generation in American history not to be better educated than their parents, which seems quite a significant fact, if true. This is obviously measured in terms of numbers of years in college and things like that. Well, that sounds rather disturbing given the world we are in. So how do you, and then we have these stories about these colossal debt burdens that many people leave college with. So how do you fix that end of the intergenerational puzzle, at least from the American point of view? And then I'd like you and Barbara perhaps to talk about what it looks like in Europe, please.
So I think a few things. One thing, just a survey of the audience. How many of you have gone to American University or spent some time? So about 50% of the audience. Look, the cost of college needs to go down in the United States, and every day you'll hear in the news a story about this debt burden that, you know, young graduates are facing with uncertain prospects about what they will do for employment. And so that's a conversation that I think will evolve and needs to be addressed. At the same time, we have really strong institutions that we need to, you know, be able to find better ways to allow people who are squarely middle class, if not, you know, allow for that upward mobility. I think there's been a lot of conversation about, you know, in terms of the spectrum of level of education, that in the early stages, pre-K, pre-5 years old, that it's really important that, you know, certain skills are taught and learned, because that actually affects then livelihood and education for the rest of the spectrum of somebody's life. And so I think those are promising things, that there are a lot more focus being put on early pre-K. And then on the vocational side, again, you know, looking at our potential workforce in the inner city, in, you know, non-affluent areas of the United States, are they getting the skills that they need to get the jobs that are there? Because there are jobs available. And, you know, computer science is a great example where thousands of jobs go unfilled every year because you don't have enough computer science graduates. So how do you get minorities, how do you get women more engaged in those fields where traditionally the emphasis has not been there? I mean, I think those are tweaks to the system that at least you're starting to see some progress being made around that adaptation. But I think, to your point, I mean, we will have to figure out a way to constantly be willing to go back and be re-educated in different points of our career, and maybe even take time out between career moves in order to do that re-education.
Do you think technology, very briefly, technology could revolutionize the costs of education, particularly at the higher end? Some people think it could. It's a big debate out there because, as you said, you want to lower the costs. Well, people have wanted to do that for a long time, but the cost curve is like this, rising faster than the cost of living and for decades. Is there a hope for that in the US, that technology could transform this?
Yes, but with caution. You know, so everybody talks about MOOCs, the massive online computing courses that you could just be anywhere USA or anywhere in the world, not USA, but anywhere, and plug into, you know, any kinds of different courses, whether you're using Khan Academy or others. I think at the moment it's oversold as an intervention, because I do think you need that teacher-student relationship. I don't think this is not a replacement for that. So, but I think in 5 or 10 years, yeah, I think that landscape will look different. And we'll actually look towards the developing world for maybe adapting some practices that are happening there in terms of education and skill building, and probably bring them over to where we are.
So, Axel, looking at the continent, particularly sort of the countries you know, Germany and Switzerland, which clearly have had an extraordinary success with education in some stage, do you think the system is, as it were, perfect as it is, needs reform, should be funded more generously? How do you see the future of, for instance, free university education?
We need to put a lot more education, money out there for education. Let me give you an example. Before I took this job here, I was teaching at the University of Chicago Booth School. I had 2 graduate courses, 50 students in them, and Chicago has a credit system where the students bid for your course. I had students in my course that bid $50,000 for sitting in my class. And they used their credits up. I was teaching these 50 students, and you could hear a pin drop. They were very focused, very concentrated. And actually, some of them came to me. I had a class on campus and a class in town. And in town, the guys came to me and said, I actually work for UBS. It's great to get to know our future chairman. And they were very focused. They worked hard on the day, and when the market closed, they did in the university education to improve their job. I was a university professor in Germany. I started in Bonn, which was a research university, one of the best in Germany. I had undergraduate courses with 120 students. They were good, interactive, and probably around 10 to 20% were excellent students that became professors all over. I moved to Frankfurt. I was director of the Center for Financial Studies. I had a chair there. I had 350 students in undergraduate classes. The ratio was lower because managing 350 students in a class is hard. My last job in the German system was Cologne University, a big university. I had 700 to 900 students in my classes. They had parallel video transfer, and I can tell you my interaction with students was suboptimal because you couldn't interact. So that type of mass university education is a problem because it isn't funded well. Students don't contribute, so the incentives for them to contribute and to pay attention are too low. Some of my colleagues had problems with managing noise levels in their lectures. I never had that problem, but some colleagues had it. But there is an issue that you need to find a balanced system. I'm absolutely agreeable with what you said. Cost of education in the US and internationally has to come down. Cost of education in Europe is too low, and there needs to be an own contribution in addition to public money. Let me end. We put 100 million into education at our university, at our headquarters in Zurich. Guess what the initial public reaction to that 150 donation by UBS was? It was a negative, because the feeling was that the UBS is buying sort of research and is influencing. Now, there are some issues. I don't want to go back to that, but I think banks like us need, and financial institutions, corporates, need to have as part of their social corporate responsibility, and I'm head of the Corporate Responsibility Committee at UBS, you need to invest in people and in minds, because banking is a people business. We need to invest in people, not just in IT and technology. And that's going to be the driver of success in the future. So I'm very committed to continuing that. And the initial criticism by putting money into education, I just take that as an encouragement. You can do it better, but you should continue to do it.
Barbara. I'm interested that, I presume it's the young people who are clapping for the idea that they're all going to have to pay more.
Well,
Barbara.
the UK is in the middle. It's kind of an interesting, for me, it's an interesting question. As you can hear, I'm American, but I've lived in the UK for 21 years. I was educated in America, and frankly, I worked my way through college and had 4 jobs. I was lucky, and I got a scholarship to go to law school, but it didn't hurt me to work my way through college. I actually am very glad that I had that experience. When I got to the UK and I found that all graduate education was funded by the state at the time, I was frankly shocked. I was shocked because rich people who could really afford to pay for their university education were getting it for free, and it was bankrupting the system. And so in the UK, we put in some tuition fees, and they were greatly distressing for everyone. There were more demonstrations in front of Parliament. This time people had their clothes on, but they were demonstrating notwithstanding. And in actual fact, the amount of money that people are required to put into the university in the UK is far less than they are in America, and more than they are in some of the rest of Europe. I think the idea of graduate education is one that we have to think about. I think people need to have very strong education in technology and in the new fields, in academia, but educating people to be in some fields which are almost like educating them to be hairdressers or other kind of forms of producing things that society doesn't need. I'm not sure we need that. I think vocational training, we haven't talked about that. There are lots of people, we're in a university here, but there are lots of jobs that need to be filled, that need to give people, we need to give people vocational training. We need to make sure they're not embarrassed by the fact that they don't have a university degree, that they can be some computer technology operators. There are a lot of operators of these technological changes that we're going to make that we need to educate. I think university education is something we have to think about. We have to charge people, but not too much so that they can't have it, but not too little that they don't value it. We have to look at other ways to employ the population, and maybe it's not always a university degree.
Just to give you context, for those who don't know, the current fee level in the UK for per annum for undergraduate education is £9,000, pretty well universally. So you can do the conversions. We tend to think of this as a golden mean between the two extremes, but it's a very interesting thing. I'm sure you didn't really mean to say that hairdressers don't perform a useful function.
They do, but do they need a university degree?
Ah, well, that's a different question.
To do that?
But otherwise, it's so boring to talk to somebody who isn't properly educated when you're having your hair cut. Never mind.
Listen, there's nobody that knows more about hair than I do, actually. Thank you very much.
I'm not rivaling that. Okay, I've let this run on because I'm not as good a moderator as I thought I was. We had a very interesting discussion of pensions, job markets and education in quite well done in time. I'm very happy to take questions. About 3 now, very quick, and I'll play. So there's somebody here, please stand up. Is there microphones? I don't know how this works here. Yes. Please say who you are and just ask a very quick question.
I'm Nadir Godrej from India, and it was a very interesting discussion, and it seems to have concluded that going the way of Switzerland is a good way to go, but we will have to spend a lot of money on education. I think a fundamental issue is inequality is increasing, and Thomas Piketty wrote a book in which he said that the returns on capital are increasing and the returns on labor are falling. We could correct this with education, but the question is, how are we going to fund it? We can't tax more than 10%. I agree with Mr. Weber. And therefore, if the returns on capital are so high, is there a need for a market communist manifesto where governments borrow money and invest in capital markets?
Okay. That's going to be one for Axel, I think. Further questions. Somebody at the back. There's somebody right at the back. Somebody, yes, you. Just turn around, stand up, and it's you. Yeah, please, yes. Guy, who looked to the back. Yes, you, yes. Good. I'm sorry, I can't. Could you stand up? And so that, yes, please, could you get a microphone to this gentleman?
No, let's have there's a woman who was going to ask a question.
Was
yeah,
there?
let's
Sorry,
have her. Go ahead and ask
didn't see you
question.
at all because I'm completely blinded by the lights. Apologize.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I'm Sylvia. I'm from University of Tokyo, but originally I'm from China. My question is, well, based on our discussion, we discussed a lot about the young people, we need more job opportunity, and the old people, we think one of the solutions is the old people should work longer time. So there is a conflict between the older generation and the younger generation. It seems that we don't have a solution. But to my point of view, maybe in our discourse now, we ignore the reality that actually maybe informal economy can be a solution. And it is existed nowadays, because it's very flexible and it can provide opportunities to other people. So my question is whether it's possible for us to change our focus or to change our paradigm and to improve the enabling environment for informal economy.
Thank you. Then I will ask the person who was, yes, you, and please. And then we'll take one more and then we'll see if they can manage to dispose of this in the minutes we have. Please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Louis from the Philippines. Mike Sandel is a Harvard philosopher who talks about the difficulty in talking about everything in economic terms because there are some things which are more than money. And the way the discourse has gone so far is the social contract for the future is like an economic problem. But is it only just economics? Thank you.
Okay, one final, yes, yes, you, yes, please. Please, okay.
Hi, I'm Clement from France. Based on the fact that we are actually consuming more resources than the Earth can produce in a year, what about degrowth that was promoted 40 years ago here in Gallen? Because it would be a quite innovative contrat social. Thank you.
Could you just, sorry, I may misunderstand the question. I understand the first part, but what's the last part?
The fact is that you believe that we have to work more because, for example, we are day after day consuming more and more. What about consuming less and less, reducing waste, reducing maybe wealth inequality? Because when we see that 50 or 60 people own half of the wealth of the earth, maybe if that part was better shared, we would not need to work more and we could all retire, make art which is the only thing that will pursue and survive through ages.
Well, that seems to fit very well with with Sandel's views. So we can compress those. So I'm going to start, Axel, with you. A question, in essence, on the. Well, actually, there are several questions which are really about distribution, partly about distribution, and one specific one: should governments borrow money to invest? With the idea, presumably, that they will be able to use the fruits of that investment for the public at large. So what is the role of the government as an intertemporal actor? Should it balance its budget in all periods, or what other view should it have?
I don't think governments should borrow money and invest to get a dividend from that, which they then can invest in education. Governments should mobilize money. And I'm a firm believer that in particular in education, private-public partnerships are the way to go. And in my view, the best way to organize the education system in a private-public partnership is I would say, one public, two private partners. And that can leverage the public purse much better. I see a role for government and public money in infrastructure provision. The basic university buildings, hiring permanent staff to run a department, and sort of infrastructure provision. There is potentially a public role to play, or a donation that is perpetuated can do the same if you move it completely to the private part. But I think on European campuses, there is a role for government to play. There is a role for the private sector to play, and donations like the ones we've given can scale up with 150 million, that public money to provide for good professors to be hired, for international experts to be hired, basically getting incentives to get people. So once you have the infrastructure, you need to add people, and you can scale that with public money and donation. And the third area is you actually need grants. You have to counter the endowment of people as they come to university, because there is a problem that people do not have the same endowment. Lady Judge reminded us of that, and you talked about your grant. So we need, as a private sector, provide grants to good students. And that's where I see a big role for the private sector as well. We at university, when we fund universities, we try and do both. We try and fund some infrastructure, in particular research grants, people, good professors, and endowments for that, and we try and put grants out to students. There is a third role to play, and that's where I think the question from the Frenchman came in here. It's actually not true. We're one of the largest wealth managers globally, and we work with almost every second billionaire globally. You wouldn't believe how our ultra-high net worth clients are focused on their philanthropy and on giving back to society. Those that have been very, very successful in their careers have a big urge at the end of their work life to perpetuate and to give back society. You've seen that with the billionaires in the US. And we are trying to help them to put money like that to good use and to donation. So there is a big issue where those that have been successful in society have a philanthropic need to give back to those societies. And I think education and putting the seeds for the next generations to be prosperous and also to be well educated is exactly where we're trying to focus them. But it starts earlier in life than universities. It's against child abuse, it's about raising primary and secondary education, it's about university education, and it's about research and development on top of that. So you can't jump too short in just focusing on universities.
We're getting to the end, but we're going to answer these questions. We're not going to actually drag us off. So, Zeenat, I'd like you to talk about the informal economy, which is, of course, very prevalent in developing countries, but of course it operates essentially outside the law and outside regulation. How would you feel about that in a developed country like the United States as a solution to employment problems?
So I think it's interesting that the questions we got were, India, Japan, China, Philippines, and that's really, not been inclusive in this conversation to those points of view. And so I think the point that you bring up of the non-state actors and the role that non-state actors have in this, whether it's philanthropists or private sector, that whether you're looking at the formal or informal economy, where in the developing world, a lot of industry happens in the informal economy. You know, I think the question is, are they going to move more towards the formal? Are we going to be willing to be more adaptive towards the informal? I'm not sure, but I do think the framework has to look at things like addressing the environment, access to health services. And so we're moving away, if you look at the Millennium Development Goals and the move now in post-2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals, it's what are those things in a framework basis that we need to be able to operate in. So education, environment, healthcare. And I think to the point of the gentleman who said, you know, this is not just an economic conversation. And I think that's right, it's not, you know, and so we should consider the role of non-state actors and then the role of the individual, particularly the young person, in informing some of these theories that live in the abstract but really are lived practically.
I'm going to give Barbara the last word, and I'd be particularly interested in your views on the question of whether the fundamental problem, particularly in the developed world, is that we're committed to a radical overconsumption model, and all generations should accept less.
You know, it's interesting to me when I was thinking about this day and this speech, I did a little research and found that the youth in the more developed countries are much more depressed about the future than the youth in the less developed countries. I think maybe that's because the youth in the more developed countries are expecting more and are seeing that they can't get what their parents might have gotten, or that it's more difficult. Whereas in less developed countries, people are optimistic about the future, and whatever they get, it's going to be more than their parents had. I'm not sure we all need, and I don't mean to sound like this, we don't need as much as we perhaps have. You talked about climate change for a minute. I worry about demand side of energy a lot, and are we going to have enough energy for the future next year, the year after? And I was thinking about people who really want to think about what's going to happen. Shall we use less? Did somebody say, can we get along on less? If you all think about saving energy, which we all need to do, you know if you really are committed, if when you walk out of a hotel room, you turn off the lights, because it's somebody else's money that you're saving. We all need to save energy, we need to save resources, we need to protect the future for our children. We could all get along with a bit less and help the people that really need it. In energy, for working, for retirement. We are all incredibly lucky. All of us, we've had a very high consumption life. We need to think about the future generations in whatever way we can.
Maybe it seems rather hypocritical for the old, doesn't it, suddenly to say, and by the way, everybody should now consume less for the rest of their lifetimes. I'm not going to summarize this, except that I am simply astonished how optimistic this panel is, because the basic, what I'm getting out of hearing from them is that it's perfectly possible to generate a system which delivers us sustainable pensions, as long as people can work forever, jobs for everybody that they'll enjoy, as long as they adapt and change consistently, and with a proper public-private partnership, an education system that will support all this. I generally think that optimism is necessary to solve all social problems. It's a necessary ingredient. So the fact that people are very, very optimistic is certainly a necessary condition for our new social contract. Whether it's a sufficient condition, however, is another matter altogether, and I'm going to leave that for the audience to decide. But please thank the panelists. I think we've had a very stimulating discussion of a tiny but pretty significant subset of the issues that were raised here by this idea of the contract between the generations, between the past, present, and the future, and I'd like you to thank them in the normal way.